All right, so now that we've made our app look fairly good, at least in my humble opinion, the next thing that we're going to do is create a component that I have found to be tremendously useful in almost every application that I build these days, and that is a component that looks like this. So basically, it's just an X inside a circle, and I see it all over pretty much every website that I use these days. Essentially, this is a really useful button that can be used to delete items, right? So we'll be adding it to our list items here in place of this big fat delete button that we have down here, right? Just to allow users to delete items in a little bit of a less intrusive way than having a giant delete button, as I said. And it's also going to be useful when we add it to our modals, right? Because right now we have this giant close button here, which is a little ugly. So we're going to replace that instead with that same X button that I showed you earlier. Okay, now creating this thing is a little bit of a fun CSS exercise. It's not super difficult, but at the same time, getting it to look right is a little bit of a challenge. So that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to create a separate component. We'll just call it X button or something like that. I'm sure it has a name, but I don't really care what it is because I think of it as just a little X circle button in my head. So anyway, let's get creating this thing. We're going to create a new component in our components folder for it. And as I said, we're just going to call this component something like xbutton.js. And here's what it's going to look like. It's actually going to be a very simple component, just JSX-wise. We're going to say export const xbutton equals, and it's going to take a single on-click prop. And what it'll do after that is we'll just have a div inside of here with the class name of... Actually, this would be a good place to use CSS modules or styled components because these styles we're adding here are very specific to our X button. So why don't we just do that right now? We're going to add a new file here, which we'll call xbutton.module.css. And inside here, we're going to create two styles, one for the div. You know what? Actually, let's just say class name. Let's import these things before they actually exist. We're going to say import styles from .xbutton.module.css. And for the class name for this one, we'll say styles.circle or something like that. Okay, and the onClick will happen when this div itself is clicked. So we'll say onClick equals onClick. That'll make it so that when the user actually clicks on that surrounding div or the contents of it, it will act as if it was clicked, and we'll be able to tap into that event in parent components. And then inside this div, we're going to create a span, which will have the class name of styles dot, and we'll call it the X, right? We're not going to be using this style elsewhere, so we'll just call it whatever we want because that seems to make sense to me. All right, now back in the CSS for this component, here's what the styles that we just created are going to look like. We're going to say dot circle, and here's what that's going to look like. It's going to have a background color, which is going to be sort of a light gray, right? That'll be the surrounding circle around the X, remember? And in order to make it circular, we're going to say border radius 50%. Okay, that'll make sure that it's a circle. And after that, we're going to say cursor pointer. We want it to have that same kind of effect as the button. We're going to set the height and width now to a fixed value. So we'll say height, and we'll set it to something odd, like 25 pixels, so that we can center the X directly in the middle. The width will be the same, 25 pixels. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to say position relative. That will allow us to absolutely position the X inside of it. And finally, we're going to say text align. We'll set that to center. All right, so that's our circle. Next thing, we're going to say the X as a style. And for this, we're going to say font weight bold. We're going to set left to 8 pixels. We're going to set the position to absolute. And we're going to set the top to 4 pixels. All right, we'll see if I lined that up correctly. Hopefully I did, but if not, we can always adjust it. And last thing for the X is we're going to want the content to be the little X character. And actually, this thing is not a true X, right? A true X isn't quite symmetrical, right? It doesn't have the same height as it does width. So in order to make this look right, I'm going to copy the multiplication symbol. You can just Google that if you want. And essentially we just have to set that as the content, and that will make sure that the contents of this span here are going to be that little X symbol. So let's take a look and see if we got this all right by displaying our X button component inside somewhere. I suppose that the modal component is as good a place as any. What we're going to do is replace this close button that we had here, which is just an ugly, it's just kind of an ugly big black button up in the top right-hand corner of our modal. We're going to replace that with our X button component we just created by saying X button. We're going to set on click to on request close, and that should be all we need to do there. So let's just change that to single quotes just to be consistent here. And if we go back to our application now, let's see if we actually did this right. We're going to open up our add a new note. And uh-oh, it looks like we ran into some sort of problem. I wonder what that could be. We need to actually return the JSX from inside our X button. I just forgot to have the return statement. Okay, there we go. Let's try that again. Hopefully it'll go better this time. Let's click on add a new note now. And sure enough, we see that we have this little circle and that it will close the thing, but it's missing the X. And you know what? As a matter of fact, now that I think about it, I was being kind of dumb. This content thing only works with pseudo elements, so we're going to remove that actually, and we're just going to put that inside the JSX of our button. So we'll remove that here for span. Just going to close that tag, and we'll put that little multiplication sign inside of there. Okay, so we're just going to paste that little X there, and now it should work like we want it to. Yep, sure enough, we see that little X there. It's not quite centered, so let me make just a little bit of an adjustment here. What we're going to do, well, let's see. So let's try maybe decreasing the width of this a little bit. We'll say height 24 pix and width 24 pix. See if that makes it a little more centered. That's looking pretty darn close to me, so we'll just leave it the way it is, I suppose. All right, and if we click on this thing, that will actually close the modal for us. So the next place that we're going to want to add that button, now that we've created it, is to our list items inside our notes list. Now, essentially what we're going to redesign this thing to look like, it's going to be a fairly straightforward process, is instead of having this big bulky thing with two buttons at the bottom, we're going to streamline it a little bit, right? Do more of the compact kind of design. And we're going to have the name of the note right here, so something like my first note. And it's going to say like the number of words right here. And then it'll have the X button here to delete the note if we want to. Now you might wonder, where are we going to put the view button? Basically what we're going to do is just have clicking on this list item bring you to the note detail page for that list item, instead of having a separate button for it as we did before. So let's do that. What we're going to do is open up our notes list component. Okay, we'll open that up here. And here's what the styling for this is going to look like. First of all, we're going to add a class name to our outer div here. Oops. Let me try that again. There we go. Okay, so for each of the items is going to have a class name of notes list item. Okay. And what we're going to do is also add an onClick property to this div, which will call a prop that will pass in from the parent component. This will allow us to navigate programmatically when the user clicks on this note container. All right, so we'll call that prop something like onClick item. And we'll pass that through to the onClick property of this div. Okay, so onClick item, and we're going to want to specify which item was clicked by passing the note ID. All right, so that's our surrounding div here. The next thing we're going to do is add some styles to each of the elements inside of here. Basically what we have to do, first of all, is we have to set this notes list item class to a flexbox. So let's open up index.css. We're just going to add some extra styles here down at the bottom. And you could do this inside a CSS module if you wanted to, but I'm just going to do it here for now. We'll say notes list item. And we're going to say flex, or display rather, flex. Okay, that will display all of the items inside that box next to each other. Oops, onClick item is not a function. What we need to do instead, we need to actually make this an anonymous function. I missed that part, and that should get rid of that error. All right, and then inside the notes list item, we're going to need to add some styles to the heading, the paragraph tag, and this div here. And in fact, we can actually remove this evenly spaced div because we're going to be removing the buttons that are inside of it. So let's just do that here. We can unindent the button and link things. In fact, we can just remove those altogether. We don't need view anymore since that's going to be taken care of by just clicking on the item itself. And for this button here, we're going to replace that with our X button component. Okay, so I'm just going to remove that like that. The onClick is going to be the same. It's going to call onRequestDelete for that note. And we're going to need to import our X button component from its file. So from X button. And if we go back and take a look now, we'll see that it's all kind of scrunched over. So we're going to have to add a few more styles to our index.css. And what that's going to look like, first of all, we're going to say align items center so that everything is displayed, centered vertically inside of there, right? We see that it's all lined up nicely now. And we're also going to say box sizing border box to make sure that it lines up correctly size-wise. We're going to say border bottom. We're going to give that a 1-pix solid light gray border along the bottom. I'll do CCC, I suppose. And you can't see it right now. Let me create another note just so you can see it. That'll just create a nice little divider between our notes so that we can actually tell where one begins and where one ends. All right, so additionally, what else do we want to add here? We're going to add cursor pointer so that it's clear you can actually have some kind of action occur by clicking on these things, even if one doesn't yet because we're not passing it in from the parent component. So the only other things here, we're going to add some nice padding here to space things out a little more, and that should be it. So let's just refresh this here. It's a little bit more padded than it was before. Let me just add some things here so you can see that. Everything is looking good so far. Now, another thing that we can do if you want is I'd like to add kind of a hover styling when you hover over these things. Maybe that's a little bit old school, but anyway, that's what we're going to do. So what we'll do here is we're just going to say dot notes list item colon hover. And when it's hovered over, we're going to set the background color to a very light gray, which we'll just use EEE for. And if we hover over these things now, I think it looks all right. So the last thing we need to do is make sure that these things are actually spaced out the way they should be. So let's go back into our notes list. And there's a few ways we can do this. I'm just going to wrap the heading and the paragraph tag inside a div with the style of flex1. And we'll put those inside of there. And here's what that'll look like now. It's looking pretty darn good in my opinion. One last thing though that's a little bit tricky is if we click on this delete button, we'll see that it will automatically trigger the onClick item prop of our list item. Now, the reason that's happening is the same reason that we had to add the e.stopPropagation function inside our modal. Basically, when we click on this X button, that click event is propagating up to this div, which also has an onClick event. So in order to prevent that, we just need to say e, and then we need to say e.stopPropagation inside of this function. We can do that right here by saying e.stopPropagation. And that'll prevent the click event from bubbling up to any outer divs that have a click event of their own. So that should prevent that now. We can just click on this thing here, and it'll work just like we want it to. All right, so the last thing we have to do here now is go back to our notes page and actually pass this onClick item prop through to our notes list component. Now remember, what we want to do is navigate the user to that note detail page. So we're going to need the use history hook from the React Router DOM package. And we're going to get a reference to history here by saying const history equals use history. And then down here where we display the notes list, we're going to say on click item equals, And we're going to use the ID to navigate the user to the correct URL. We're going to say history.push using backticks. Oops, there we go. Using backticks. Now we're going to say /notes/ and then we're going to put the notes ID, or just the ID rather, that we're getting from this argument in that URL. So now what should happen is if we click on one of these notes, it'll take us straight through to the notes note detail page. Awesome, and that's the basic rewrite for our notes list items. Everything is looking pretty good now with this little X button here. Feel free to fiddle around with that a little more if you want to change the way it looks, but I'm thinking it's looking pretty good. So anyway, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.